Thanks, Richard. If we can move on to the next slide already, that would be great. So one of the things that's become really important with any of these sorts of events is an acknowledgement of country. And I'm actually in my office at Murdoch, and it's really important to acknowledge that Murdoch University sits on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. My respects being paid to their culture and leadership of Noongar elders past and present is in part because Murdoch has always been a place of learning. This location has been a place where people gathered together to share understandings and knowledge, and Murdoch's really proud to continue that tradition. But there's also people sitting in all sorts of different locations around the state, and so it's important to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging in those regional areas as well. And if there are any Aboriginal people amongst us, then you are acknowledged as well. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. A little bit about me. One of the things that can happen sometimes is people come from universities and like to tell others about their research and the things that they've been doing, and people don't necessarily know much about them. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background, partly because my background is mixed. I'm not just a researcher. I've been doing research in the volunteering area since the early 1990s, but in fact, I've also been an active volunteer and served my time on school P&Cs and playgroup committees and other sorts of activities that you would probably recognise. So my presentation tonight largely comes from my research, but my research is grounded in the sorts of things that I have been involved with as a volunteer. So one of the things we're going to do this evening is actually talk about some vignettes or scenarios that have actually been gathered from a whole range of different places, not just my personal experience, but also running workshops with managers of volunteers, with voluntary associations, with, in fact, at different times at the WACSSO State Conference. And what I've done over time is put together these scenarios or vignettes which people recognise. But it's really important for you to realise that even if you think you know these people, they've actually been developed from more than one example. So please don't attach the labels that I've used to the people that you know, because in fact, one of the things that happens is if you attach a label to people, you're starting off on the wrong foot in terms of having great volunteer interactions. So it just helps us to have a bit of an idea about the sorts of things that people encounter. And some of these might be ones that you're familiar with. Now, Richard's going to put up a little list of some of those scenarios or vignettes for you to have a bit of a look at. And we're going to ask you to choose 5, which might help us to decide which ones we'll talk about first. Part of the reason for that is because we don't want to talk about things that you as an audience aren't interested in, but also because if we're going to try and manage the time, it's better to talk about, give priority to those things that you're most interested in. So each of these is a very short summary of what's contained in the vignette. And if we just like to, you just like to pick 5, then we can get a sense of which ones are the most ones that people would like to talk about. Okay. What I'm going to ask you to do is, first of all, just have a read of this, and then perhaps if anybody would like to contribute something either in the chat or by raising their hand as just their initial reaction to this. So let me just elaborate a little in relation to this. It's dark, the meeting's over, everybody's walking out to their cars, and there's a sense that this person that's finished up the meeting wasn't satisfied anyway, but people out in the car park have something to say. So Camilla has raised or commented that that people don't speak up during meetings, and especially to disagree. And Jane has observed the silent people in meetings are sometimes the hardest after a meeting. And this is certainly something that comes up repeatedly, not just in a P&C setting, but in lots and lots of different settings, even in workplaces, where people feel that they are okay to criticise what happened in a meeting, even though they didn't necessarily participate. So what sorts of things do you think might contribute to people not speaking up in meetings? Anybody? So they feel that they will stand out and don't want attention drawn to them, or fear of being shut down. Now there's two different responses there: not feeling safe or being uncomfortable to talk in a large group, to further observations. Okay, so we're starting to get a sense here that there's a couple of reasons, including feel of looking like a fool if you don't know enough, or previous experiences of being dismissed, knowing there are groups that vote together. So there's patterns that happen in meetings that we are starting to emerge in these responses. One of the things that happens if you're perhaps in Robin's situation is that you might have chaired the meeting and felt dissatisfied, but wanted people to speak up and they didn't. The chair of the meeting sometimes finds themselves not knowing whether to invite more people to contribute or not. But there are other things that can happen in a meeting as well, particularly if there's a sense that the old guard or the group that knows what's going on is in favour of the direction that discussion or the meeting is going. So Vivian has observed people feel that speaking up at the meeting can result in resentment, especially if you're a new member, which is interesting because that can go in both ways. It is also the case that new people in the organisation can feel like it's the old guard who are standing out in the car park criticising what happened in the meeting because things are not going the way that they used to. Okay, so what is it about this sort of situation? Is it Robin's responsibility to manage this situation? Sally thinks yes. As does Anita and Valentina. Camilla can, in this situation in the car park, point out that nothing was said. Who else might have responsibility then? So adults need to speak up too, yes. And there is some collective responsibility. Okay, so if there's collective responsibility and there are strategies to encourage or to contribute, what sort of strategies might be appropriate? So the whole committee has a responsibility. What sort of responsibility might they have? What might they be able to do? Jenny's suggesting break a meeting into small groups to discuss, which of course, if you've got a large group of people in the meeting, yes, that's possible to do. Or pairing up, asking people to talk to each other in pairs before they speak. Go around the room and ask everyone to speak. And one of the options that's been put here is a silent vote option. Certainly a silent vote option is something that you would want to use somewhat sparingly, because if it becomes that sort of approach all the time, then people feel that there's an element of secrecy or mistrust. But in really important issues, sometimes that might be the way to operate. What else can be done? One of the things that I've seen work reasonably well is to actually ask the whole room to consider the different perspectives. And so Sally has suggested that the chair is responsible to set the scene, that all opinions are valid. Absolutely. And the option of talking through the process and putting a motion before it is done is certainly an important one, especially if many of the people in the meeting are not there all the time and don't know how those sort of work. But what can happen is that you can actually designate people in the room to put the different perspectives about whatever it is that's being voted on, so that it can have the different perspectives viewed. Jenny has suggested that building community with social parts of a meeting is an important thing to develop that communication over time and give perhaps people the confidence to speak up. And Camilla has identified that trying to give as much information about why something hasn't worked in the past, why things might be different now, and getting rid of some of those obstacles and how that might work. Certainly, the idea that it's appropriate to stand out in the car park and criticise what's happened in the meeting is something that needs to be discouraged. So moving that discussion that happened in the car park back into the room is something that can be quite important. And I have seen one meeting chair actually break for coffee before the vote so that all the opinions had been aired, some of the debate had taken place, but then coffee or a break meant that people had the opportunity to have side conversations and ask questions. Of course, it depends how cliquey the groups are and whether people might be persuaded in directions that they might not otherwise have voted. But certainly that idea of allowing conversations to take place is an important one. Vivian has observed that it's probably a good idea to remind people about the code of conduct and that everybody's view is valuable. And some of the techniques that are used can include things like nominating people to speak up from different parts of the community in relation to a particular decision or vote. Now, one of the things that's really important is that every one of these scenarios, of course, is potentially going to happen in your setting, but your setting has its own particular things about it. So in a small school where there's only a very small number of people, then there might be clear lines that people tend to vote on, and trying to raise some of the issues and get a lot of the things discussed in an informal way might be a better option than taking it the more formal route as the beginning of the process. However, you still need to remember that the way to get the final decision through is a vote, is a motion on the floor and a vote, and so on. Camilla has observed that trying to have less formal environments and set up the room in a less formal way can actually help with that. Okay, does anyone have any questions in relation to this particular one? We'll move on to the one that got the next, was the next most popular or least popular, however you want to put it, shortly, because we're going to come back at the end and think about some of the things that have emerged as being common to these. But if anyone's got any questions in relation to this one particularly before we move forward.
We don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay, so that's great. So let's move on to the next one, which was...
I think it's going to be the new broom. The
new broom, okay. Okay, so this is potentially, Robin could have been the new broom in the meeting before, but she might also have been around for a very long time. But Araful is a new committee member here and has some great ideas about how to do things, and was actually recruited to help revitalise the organisation because people realised that the same faces had been at the meetings a lot, and that Araful had turned up to some of the more general meetings but hadn't actually put his hand up to be part of the executive or part of the committee, and it was felt that his contribution would be valued. But he wants to bring in new ways of doing things, including meeting procedure, instead of the random unstructured meeting format that everybody's used to. And he's really encountering some resistance in relation to this. So the first question is, why would he be encountering resistance? He was recruited to bring in new ideas and new ways of doing things. Why do you think he would be encountering resistance? Valentina has observed fear of change. Well, we human beings are all a little bit uncomfortable with change, aren't we? Particularly if it's not introduced by us. The observation has been made by Jenny that perhaps the people who recruited him aren't supporting him. But yes, perhaps existing members are feeling judged. That expression, "don't fix what's not broken," is an interesting one, because the idea that something should stay the same because it's not broken is something that we have to be a little mindful of, the fact that lots of things are changing around it, so it might become a little bit outdated. Jenny's observation is an interesting one, because it's not one that has been raised in relation to this one before that I've seen, but an important one nonetheless, and that is that perhaps he's male and the other members aren't. So his involvement might be something that people aren't used to. The other thing is that people feel comfortable with the things that they're already doing. Okay, so what do you suggest Araful might do in order to encourage people to come with him in terms of the changes that he would like to make? It's interesting that maybe the first question is, do we need to bring in new meeting procedure instead of the unstructured format that everybody's used to? Okay, so there's some quite important chat coming through here, including come across as friendly and open rather than trying to force his way in, looking at making some changes at a time, so slowly, and reminding everybody why he was recruited to become involved. It's also the case that, yes, Jenny, explaining what it is that he would like to achieve can actually bring people with him. And yes, encouraging a few at a time, although you have to be careful about appearing to talk to some people about things and not others. The question about how unstructured are they and why procedure matters, it's interesting that there are rules in place about how meetings should be conducted and what sort of processes should be in place. And often you're better to make the change for those sorts of procedural things before you need them. And sometimes it can be implying that, well, we might need this sort of meeting procedure or structure in the future because things might go wrong, implies that you're expecting some things to go wrong. So it's going to be a case of putting the case carefully rather than trying to impose them on people. Penny is saying people need to understand and be contributors to change. So yes, bringing the people along with him and work out what is the most important part of the procedure that needs to change first. Anita's suggesting giving examples of how it's worked previously, if he has that experience, and also asking others to contribute what they think needs changing so they feel included. And certainly just dragging out the Constitution and saying this is what we need to do and we're going to do X, Y, and Z from the next meeting onwards might not necessarily bring everybody along with him. So asking people what they think might be the most important things to change first. It also goes back to the question that was posed by Jane about how unstructured are they, because sometimes when you look at something, it appears unstructured when you've come in from the outside, but actually there's a form and a process that is in place that is working. So what are the things that need changing and tweaking now, and how can we bring the changes in a little bit at a time? I think one of the things that happens when we bring new people in is the people who are already there can feel uncomfortable because they don't want the change, but also they can feel relieved. There's new people to hand over to, but only if they feel confident that those new people are going to do things that are in the best interests of the organisation. So does anyone have any questions or observations or something else that they would like to say in relation to Araful or this committee that he is trying to bring meeting procedure to? Yes, they were all good ideas. What's the role of the chair in that situation? I guess it's one of those things that Araful and the chair need to have a bit of a conversation, because Araful can't bring in these things without the chair being involved. And constructive feedback is really important. People who've done something in the past should be applauded for what they've done in the past. And this is for the future, not necessarily a criticism of what has gone before. Okay, so Richard, shall we move on to the third ranked of the cases that we have?
And I think it was the odd volunteer. I was quite surprised this one came up, but
oh, okay.
I was quite surprised that Facebook Fiend wasn't one of the most popular, but we will go on to this one. Actually, the odd volunteer actually might be the last one. There it is.
Yes, I think it might be. Okay, so lots of people comment about Jean. She turns up to everything, even when she doesn't have a role. And she wears what people describe as funny clothes, and sometimes these appear maybe that they haven't been washed recently. She talks about things that she's heard and seen that others don't believe or understand, and her behaviour is considered by, it says, clients, volunteers and other staff members to be bizarre, because this is a case that comes up in lots and lots of different settings. But it also comes up in school settings, and it can be that her behaviour is considered by parents, members of the P&C and staff members to be just that little bit odd. Any initial observations from people about this? It is a very tricky to manage sort of situation, Jane, and the idea of don't judge a book by its cover is very important. Now, I will remind you all that to some degree Chatham House rules have to apply here, and Camilla has observed that there's a parent who brings her child to the meetings and the child is unhappy and restless, and the parent never actually raises anything, and it's quite a tough situation. So it is important, Robin, to accept everybody and possibly manage people too. And yes, we are all a bit odd doing this with our Tuesday evening, but it does challenge how inclusive we really are. And it's very important for people to stop and think about, okay, well, you know, first of all, are there things here that we need to be mindful of that might need different sort of attention? But also, is Jean coming along because this is her social connection to the world, and her connection potentially via her child or children might be the only one that she has, where that sort of interaction has to be managed well and provide that person with the level of social support. It seems that
Tanya's ready to go.
Richard?
To read the chat and see everyone. Look, Jean is the kind of person that I want to know. Jean is the person that I will have a relationship with before the meeting and get to know her, so that if there is areas that need some guidance, we can have a conversation outside the meeting before ever arises. But I love Jeans because they turn up to everything. And sometimes it's that steadfast volunteer that seems to do maybe just those little jobs that no one else is doing, or that don't have that happen in the background, that they really add value. So Jean, I would have a relationship with, I would build a friendship with there, and if there's areas that you need to discuss, you've already got a relationship where you can have maybe a conversation that's a little bit difficult, just to give some guidance along.
And Pania, that's great. I think you would be the sort of person that would include Jean because your style is inclusive, but others who are on committees don't necessarily feel quite as comfortable doing that. And sometimes the chair or the president might actually think, this is not something I want to do, but I can invite one of the other executive to take Jean under their wing or involve her in things in a way that has those lines of communication open and available should they become necessary. Absolutely. And I think too, private conversations will allow some of those things perhaps to be observed more broadly. And sometimes those private conversations might reveal things that need to be referred to the school for assistance. The fact that perhaps there needs to be that that support from the school to the family in some way, shape or form. It's not the responsibility of the P&C to do that, but there might be some other possibilities that need to be thought about. Sally's actually observed, what if someone wants to be a friend but others want more of a professional relationship? And certainly that's going to be the case across the whole whole group. And yes, if the things she says are not reflective of what the group is trying to achieve, there could be detriment from it. I think it's the case that in those sorts of situations, if some level of relationship has been developed or inclusion has been set up, then it is easier to have the conversation and say, actually, perhaps it's best if you don't get involved in this, or let's find you something different to do or be involved in. Expanding on that a little bit, there are also times when the involvement of, shall we say, odd, and it's in inverted commas for a reason because we are all odd, volunteers can actually mean we need to be thinking a little bit outside the box too, because perhaps she should be given a role. And if she's given a particular role or a particular something that she can do, that might change her relationship with everybody. So it's important for it to be handled very sensitively. So we've got school communities know such people, and I don't think a group should be too concerned about what others think about the P&C from the things that she says. Yes, just because she's saying those things doesn't mean that that it reflects on the organisation, but it may reflect on the organisation if she's left isolated and not included in things. It certainly does show dedication that she's if she's attending everything. I do have stories of even more odd volunteers, including in one situation where one of the people that was turning up to meetings would sit in the corner and just flick a pen on and off for the whole meeting and not say a word to anybody and then leave. And people were very concerned about what this meant and what the potential risk this person might be to others. And in that situation, one of the people from the committee actually took responsibility for talking to her and discovered that she was experiencing a mental illness and didn't know where else to go. So sometimes it's about trying to find out a little bit more about this person. It's highly unlikely that Jean has a mental illness, but it could be that there are other things going on, even just loneliness. So you say, Valentina, that it's not a choice, this is a not-for-profit, but people actually can exclude others by their behaviours, by not including individuals in conversation and so on, even if they're not necessarily excluding them by sending them away. So the behaviour of inclusion is quite an important one. Shall we move on to another one, or do people want to continue discussing Jean?
There we go.
Okay. So we've all been in a meeting where it's late at night and everybody wants to go home, and Ian raises something at the end of the night that causes everybody to roll their eyes. Really? Did he not just want a decision and be done with it? Surely it was not that important. Some people just don't get it about going with the flow and letting things happen. Nobody is in the mood for a debate at this hour. How many of you have experienced the disruptive questioner? Vivian has, Camilla.
There's quite a few coming through.
Yes, just last week. Yes, so this is a familiar one. Camilla, I've been the disruptive questioner. Great move. I think it's important to think about why and what value we can get from disruptive questioners. So some work that was done by Tucker and Edmondson in the United States at probably about 20 years ago now talked about disruptive questioners and noisy complainers and other types of people as being something that can really add value to an organisation. So if you've been the disruptive questioner or you've encouraged the disruptive questioner, then I think that's a great thing. But what can happen is that the meeting dynamics can be thrown out by this person doing this all the time. So there's a couple of things that are quite important. The work that was done in the United States actually was about how accepting what the organisation does without asking the questions, just, oh, okay, fine, can actually be detrimental, because the organisation never learns from the mistakes, or the decisions always go in the same sort of direction. And one of the examples that doesn't come from this setting at all, it comes from a hospital setting, is one that's quite an easy one to follow, though. So I'm just going to tell you the story, and then we can think about how that applies in the P&C setting. So the nurse goes to the linen cupboard to change the sheets for Ward A, and there are none left. There's none of the right sort of sheets left. So she goes to Ward B and goes to the linen store for there and takes sheets from there and fixes the problem. But what happens next time round is that the linen that's delivered, Ward A still doesn't get enough sheets, and Ward B gets more than they need, because the nurse has taken from over here and used over there. And if she had in some way, shape or form raised the question as to why it was being done in a particular way, the longer term problem might actually be fixed, instead of it being just keep on going the way that we've always gone, and then every nurse has to slowly but surely go and get the sheets from the other place. Now, that's a really simple story, but it's a one that illustrates why having people ask the questions as to why we do things the way we do, or why things are a particular way, can actually be quite useful. Camilla has commented that our chair will usually take all questions on board, and then we'll come back to a question at the next meeting if it's late in the meeting and isn't urgent, which, yes, is one of the possibilities, one of the ways of doing it. One of the other things that can be done, now there are all sorts of rules about how meetings should be conducted, and what sort of decisions need advance notice and that sort of thing. But it can also be that if you get on a roll, you can set things up so that things that are going to come up for decision further down the track start getting raised at earlier meetings. This is the sort of stuff we're talking about at the moment. These are the sorts of things that you might like to be starting to think about questions for. So you have the decision is not at this meeting, the decision is at a future meeting, but this is where we're starting to go with this particular whatever it is. What that starts to do is give people the opportunity to think in advance for whatever it is that they might be a disruptive questioner about. And the other thing is that the order on the agenda might mean that the things that are for decision have already been talked about a lot in the past, so therefore it's just those few last questions that need to be dealt with before a decision is made. There are all sorts of other possibilities in relation to this as well, and it may be that there's some other reason that Ian is the disruptive questioner. Anyone think of any? Okay, so some people can't think of any, but Robin's suggesting he might be annoyed about something else, and yes, that might be the case. Sometimes it can be that there's personal conflict, that he's, yes, so Jenny has observed potentially there's some political behaviour going on. There might also be things like, for example, Ian might have been the previous chair and no longer in the role. So he's experienced a loss of power. Maybe he has a history of not being heard and therefore agitates until he feels like he is heard. But yes, there are all sorts of reasons. What is the responsibility of the chair in that sort of situation then? So it's probably the responsibility of the chair to think about what time it is of the night, what the subject matter is, who it is that's raising their hand, and how it is that the person can be heard, but the meeting can also be managed quite well. Yes, there's some observations made here. Jane has observed that Chair needs to call for agenda items earlier and then late business doesn't come up, but also that idea of perhaps carry things over to the next meeting, potentially speak with Ian about his situation. The agenda order is one of the really important things that seems to be coming up quite a lot these days, and a lot of meeting agenda items actually have discussion time allocated, yes, as Vivian has observed, but also has for noting, for future decision, for discussion, clustered things together and try to make it clear what is an ongoing conversation, what are the things that have to be decided tonight, and so on. Of course, you also need to be careful that if you allocate agenda items a specific discussion time, that if there's still plenty of discussion to be had because it is a hot topic, then how do you go about varying the allocated discussion times? Do you defer discussion on that item to the next meeting, or do you agree to continue the discussion time? Because guillotining discussion just to get something through because it's the allocated discussion time actually creates even more resentment than allowing somebody to have their say towards the end of the evening. Okay, where are we at in terms of the top 5 that we got? Ingrid has a negative response to every suggestion made by others to change things or to try something new. That won't work with our people. We've tried that and it didn't work. And she actively discourages people from putting up ideas. How many of you know a wet blanket? What's interesting to me is that there's always times when, in fact, when somebody suggests something different or new, I find myself at times going, nah, won't work, before I've given it time and thought about it. Jenny, it appears perhaps you have done that at times as well. It's interesting how we can immediately, if it doesn't fit with that way of thinking or our idea about what was going to happen, that we our immediate reaction is no thanks or don't want to go there. That's partly fits with some of the things that about being defensive about change. Sometimes it's because you actually know things about what it is that they're suggesting that might be why it might not work. But it's also the case that, in fact, it's a good idea to explore what it is that that is being raised. However, how do you encourage somebody like Ingrid to frame her thinking in a different way? Because, in fact, you do want to hear the experiences of those who have been there before or who have experiences that didn't work. But what you want to do is find out why whatever it was didn't work and whether there are ways to overcome the obstacles that that got in the way last time. We kind of did discuss this a little bit before, but it is often the case that if you can flip it around and look at it from the other side, you can get the benefit from whatever it is that the wet blanket is objecting to. Camilla is observing that it's hard when you've seen things fail many times or know the history of a situation. Yes, but sometimes it's actually a good idea to tease those out and identify, okay, well, these are the reasons that it didn't work last time. What has changed? What are the things that make it maybe time to try again? Vivian is suggesting that actually encouraging or including Ingrid in discussions about why it might work this time can actually be a way to change some of the thinking. Okay, we have got a couple more if you would like to just quickly explore some of the others. Richard, do you want to pick one?
I would like to go to Facebook Fiend if you
okay, let's
don't mind.
So Vivian, Valentina has just said in relation to the wet blanket, I try to think how can we make it successful. And absolutely, try and think how we can make it successful. One of the things that we might want to do is look at all the things that Ingrid has identified as being obstacles and work out, okay, well, if that obstacle came up, how might we cope with it? Okay, we're going to have a little bit of a look at a Facebook fiend. Of course, it's not necessarily Facebook these days. The types of social media that are out there are being that are being used change so often that I can't keep up. But Leanne is active on social media and promotes all sorts of activities associated with the organisation far and wide. And it's great because fundraisers and celebrations and general news and so on get spread out into the community. But recently she's also been sharing and commenting on a range of topics and adding her opinion to the official posts that are not always in keeping with the social media policy decision, that should say, and PNC Code of Conduct. And her comments are increasingly belligerent, and attempts to ask her to be more careful have led to her responding, I'm entitled to my opinion. And if you put things out publicly, then let the public, or then the public is entitled to respond. First of all, same question as I've asked about a few of these. Do we know the Facebook fiend? Is Leanne a familiar person?
I don't know.
Okay, so there are people that haven't encountered this and people that have, and I think it's probably going to have some bearing on how active social media is throughout the school community, but also how carefully it happens. I know that's interesting. So not from members, but yes, from parents. So it is not always the case that the people commenting are within the PNC, but certainly if they're part of the parent community, then to some degree outsiders and others are not necessarily going to know who is and who isn't a member. So is it still the case that you need to be a financial member? Yes, you do. So sometimes it's the case that somebody needs to take responsibility for managing this. And if you've got a social media policy and you can refer to the PNC Code of Conduct, then that provides some basis for tackling the person. But it is the case that it's a very sensitive issue. Thoughts about whose responsibility it is? So Penny is saying if it doesn't meet the PNC social media policy, then the comments need to be moderated or removed. However, sometimes that can aggravate the situation. Vivian is saying posts should be approved by those with admin rights. Yes. Jane, I think you're probably right in the sense of what is it that has triggered Leanne's behaviour. Now, sometimes it might have nothing to do with the PNC or the school. It might just be that there are things going on. But it is the case that simply removing the posts or moderating them might simply add fuel to the fire. It's, yes, you need to manage what's going out there publicly, but it's also the case that somebody needs to take responsibility for having a conversation with Leanne about what's going on. Whose responsibility do you think that is? Jenny said many PNCs set up a moderation team. Presumably that's the people with admin rights to the social media. But whose responsibility would it be to have a private word? Is it the president's responsibility? Certainly, whatever the approach is that's going to be taken, the executive probably have responsibility for working out what the best thing to do is. But perhaps it is the case that, yes, as Robin has suggested, thinking about who might have a relationship with Leanne that would allow that conversation to take place, whoever takes on that responsibility has the risk, I guess, of becoming the target of whatever the anger is. But yes, it's one of those things that the exec should be taking some level of responsibility for having a conversation. what's interesting is that sometimes organisations resort to restating the policy or just managing the posts without actually approaching the individual concerned, and sometimes that actually simply isolates them more. A little bit like the odd bod, you have to be careful about overreacting, as Jenny has said. Important, I think, that all of these things that we've talked about so far actually have as their basis conversations. So what I'd like to do now, Richard, is move on to the slides that are the, rather than the vignettes, the, here we go. So one of the things that is very widespread in relation to volunteers and keeping people involved in organisations is the things that keep people attached. And people continue to provide time and effort and whatever else that you want from them if they feel like they're getting some level of respect, which of course can mean being heard, that they get recognised, even if it's just that opportunity for somebody to say a quiet thank you as they're leaving, or to be included with a cup of coffee or whatever. And also well-being. There's a lot of research that shows that the social connection that comes from volunteering actually has health benefits. And people who feel like they're part of the community, the school community, actually keep coming back for more. So people stay with an organisation. Now, P&Cs is an interesting one because people, the people move on quite often, particularly the parents part of the P&C move on as their children move on from the school community. So there's like a natural turnover, the same with sporting organisations. But worldwide, there's evidence that shows that there are three things that keep people attached to the organisation. One is the social connection, that is the other people that they volunteer with and for, and that social connection is something that they really like. But there are two other things. One is connection to the mission, so a belief in what the organisation is doing, the contribution that they're making, and that they are making a difference. So in relation to what the students and the school are getting out of the P&C, being involved in what's going on, including in fundraising or decision making, or just turning up to be part of the school community. And the third thing is the task. So some people keep coming back, not because they believe in the mission, not because they've made friends, but because the actual task that they're doing is something that they get satisfaction out of. Now, this can mean somebody who's absolutely loves writing newsletters, for example, and these days they tend to be electronic newsletters or websites or whatever, but people keep coming back and doing that because they really enjoy that particular task. So if you're talking about looking at the way to keep people attached to the organisation, that might help to diagnose some of the situations that you find. So, for example, the disruptive questioner might actually be they think that their contribution that they can make is to be the devil's advocate in whatever the situation is, and that's something that they take pride in. So there can be some things that that you need to think about slightly differently in terms of what's going on here. What is the problem? Valentina has observed her friend got her involved with the P&C, and she had a goal in mind, and I could help her with it once she became the treasurer. The other thing that's really interesting about volunteering is that the recruitment process is still very much word of mouth, even if that word of mouth is something comes through on the social media, on the Facebook page saying something, somebody needs volunteers, and someone else says, oh, Joe, this would interest you. You should go and have a look. And some of those sorts of word of mouth stories are the things that keep people, that connect people to the organisation. Let's move on to the next one now, Richard. So there are some uncomfortable bits though, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of these. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but if you want me to come back to any of them, if we've got time, please ask. So one of the things that I've actually been guilty of, although I wasn't aware of it at the time, is what is known as purple circles. Now, the idea of the purple circle comes from the religious advisors to the king who wore purple. But purple circles are a term that's used for the group that forms at the exec level or around the president and the exec, who know about what's going on and who are wise about what's going on, and who actually can find themselves making decisions and having conversations that are insular. And then when they go to the meeting setting, there's conversations that take place that are only at the surface level. A lot of the deep thinking has already been done. And outsiders or newcomers or people who are not necessarily part of that circle can feel like they don't get a say, not because they were deliberately excluded by the purple circle, but because they weren't part of some of those informal conversations that take place outside the meeting. I say I've been guilty of this. I was involved with a PNC where we were going very late at night for lots and lots of meetings. And so the president put something in place that was to try and shorten the meetings a little bit. And some of that meant that there were pre-conversations about, yep, this is the direction we should be going. We've got, this is the motion that should be put, and so on. And I was party to that. It was only when someone pointed out that, well, you were talking a language in the meeting that we just couldn't even keep up with, let alone object to, that I sort of, oh, wow, step back. Long time ago now, my children are all in their 20s, but certainly something that I have come across repeatedly in different sorts of settings, not just in PNC organisations. There's also a thing called founders syndrome. Now, generally it refers to the people that start an organisation or start an association, but it's actually now used to label those people who are hanging on to the wave that we've always done things and are not welcoming of change. Now, founders syndrome happens in family businesses when people aren't ready to hand the baton on to the next generation, happens in voluntary associations when the founder isn't ready to hand over to the next level, the board or whoever, happens in associations where people have been in the executive roles for quite some time and just keep getting re-elected, so there's no new blood. That not handing on to the next people can be quite difficult. We also come across martyrs, people who like to complain a lot about how much they do and how much time it takes and so on, but who actually love the fact that they can complain. And sometimes it's necessary to say to those people, just let some of it go, give some of the bits to other people and take it off them, despite the fact that you taking it off them will be something else for them to be a martyr about. There's also a whole range of other behaviours, ageist behaviours, where people are either considered to be too young and inexperienced or ageing to the point where they're no longer capable and so on, or the sorts of behaviours where people from particular backgrounds are racist behaviours, where people from particular backgrounds are not considered to be able to understand how we do things around here. There's also a lot of evidence that in associations and in all sorts of other organisations that rumour and gossip can actually create lots of divides that aren't necessarily helpful, and that organisations need to take some responsibility for trying to stem some of those sorts of behaviours. But what becomes even worse is where whatever that rumour and gossip is actually about laughing at somebody who perhaps is a gene and is a little bit odd, or playing pranks on somebody because they didn't understand and so on. And sometimes these sorts of behaviours can become a form of bullying or a form of behaviour that excludes others from being involved in whatever it is that the organisation is doing and stops people from coming back. All of those can actually create, first of all, a waning of membership or of participation, but also can change the decision-making processes, because the politics and the way people are feeling get in the way of some level of objectivity and logic in that process. And yes, as Vivian has observed, they really affect the reputation of the committee. And it can undermine all the good work that's being done if some of those sorts of things are allowed to keep going. So there's a responsibility on the committee to stop and think and work out, okay, how are we going to manage some of these situations? Sometimes it's beyond the scope of what the committee can do, but sometimes there's actually some level of difficult conversation that might need to take place. Has anybody got any comments or questions in relation to that before I move on to what's getting close to the end of what I wanted to talk about? Okay, well, I'll keep going, but if what we'll do is the top three on that list, you're talking about the purple circles, founders syndrome and martyrs. They are the hardest, yes, and all of those things are difficult, but every conversation that's a difficult conversation has some really key things that I'll talk about shortly. At the end of the day, there are lots of rules and things in place, but they're really there to help, not to hinder. So there's a balance to be had for going and saying, well, this is the process or the procedure that we need to follow, and these are the things that are in place to help us manage this situation, rather than actually going to the extreme and using the rules to punish people for wanting to contribute and trying to do things in a particular way. Certainly, expectations set early guide behaviour. So a new year, a new committee, a new school year, talking to people about, okay, well, we're going to try some different things in our meetings this year. So these are some of the things that we're going to try. What should we start with? Setting those expectations early about everybody's going to get a say. The other thing is that not all disruption is bad behaviour. So, for example, our disruptive questioner might actually be trying to stimulate debate and discussion to make sure that good decisions are being made. They might actually be trying to work out what it is that will prevent the nurse having to go and get the sheets from the other linen cupboard instead of the one that's near where she works. Importantly, if you start thinking about the attachment to the people, attachment to the task, and attachment to the mission, actually everybody's there for the benefit of the organisation. And if the idea is that you're going to try and change something, then trying to work out what it is, that's the superordinate goal that everybody's aiming for, can be at the base of all of that. People can be really unaware of their impact. And as I said, I was actually quite taken aback to feel like I hadn't perhaps been part of a purple circle that was excluding others from the way things were happening. I remember hearing a story from a student of mine who had joined a local SES organisation, and he went along to a couple of the training sessions that they had and was finding that despite the fact that there was only once a week that the group was getting together, that somehow he felt excluded. And so one night he sort of stayed back after the training, and his intention was to ask a couple of people about, you know, how can I get into this group a bit better, only to find that the group were adjourning to the pub after the training sessions and nobody had invited him to join them. They were quite happy to have him join, to be another labourer, to be able to do, but they hadn't invited him to the social aspect of what they were doing. He never went back. It wasn't what he was looking for. At the end of the day, good communication is at the base of it all, and the difficult conversations are really the hardest part. There are a couple of things that you can do if you're the one that has to have the difficult conversation, and one of them is to write down what it is that you would like the person to know and understand. That doesn't mean you read it to them, of course you don't. But if you can focus on the behaviour, not the person, then and frame the message in such a way that you can tell them what it is that you need to talk to them about and what the impact is of what they're doing, you then might be able to work away with them in a wee conversation to change whatever it is. Or when you have the wee conversation to go, oh, wow, hadn't thought about it like that, don't change, because that's that process. But you've also got to listen to their response in order to reach that sort of point of what are we going to do. The other thing is, if you do have a difficult conversation with somebody, it's really important to follow up in the next few days to see how they're feeling about that. Because quite often people will take in what's been said, and the impact of that is not felt by them until later. People do find it hard to be diplomatic when they need to communicate something, Vivian, but I think, in fact, we can choose amongst our group who is the most diplomatic of us and help them to frame whatever it is that needs to be communicated, whether it's in private or in public. It's better if it's in private, if it's about an individual. And part of being diplomatic is also that process of listening to what they respond and working out a we solution to whatever the situation is. We've reached 8:15. I think we've got no more slides, but what I would really like to do is hear from you if you've got some things that perhaps we can use this last little while to discuss, think about, talk about. If anybody wants to challenge any of the things that I've said, I'm open to hear those sorts of things as well.
Okay, those come through to you, Meg? You can see
Yes,
them?
I'm just starting to get some now. So main challenges with volunteers, as in getting people to volunteer, Camilla, I'm presuming that's what you mean. Those that are external to the committee itself. Yeah, so people who are doing things that are perhaps beyond the scope of what you would like them to do, or not doing the things that you would like them to do. Same as with everything else, clear expectations and feedback on how they're going are the ways to encourage them to do things within the scope of what you want them to do. And sometimes actually asking people to step back and have a look at their own behaviour is the only thing that you can do. So there's a couple of things that occur to me. First of all, that volunteering in the style that we have for P&Cs is actually a bit of an Anglo tradition, and many of the communities from which our migrant and refugee parents come, their tradition is not to be involved in that same way. So it's actually not just a case of having the courage to join something in the first place, it's that having an understanding of what the role is and so on. And one of the things I've seen work, I was going to say well, but it's not necessarily well, but which is a start, is encouraging people to join together and take up roles together. And some of those roles can be about preparing things in the newsletters that are aimed at the particular communities that you're trying to encourage to be involved. And, you know, these are the sorts of things that parents do on sports day that you might not be familiar with, that encourages it. So, you know, when you come on the day, this is what people do, because in fact, getting parents involved in the school community can be quite challenging if they turn up and they didn't realise that they were supposed to bring a picnic lunch and a blanket and a chair. You know, like some of those sorts of things can be, if we grew up in those in the community and we know that's what you do, then that's what we know to do. My children went to a school that had a very diverse range of communities, people from all sorts of different backgrounds, but they tended to be educated, and therefore English language wasn't an obstacle, and sometimes that can be part of the picture as well. It is the case that offering opportunities for them to join in things not by themselves but with others is the first step. I don't know if that helps, but it's certainly a challenge that we need to be thinking about. What do P&Cs look like? They're these strange beasts that are not necessarily common to other parts of the world.
No, that's really good. Thank you. And you know, I definitely liked your point about encouraging people in groups, and I think you know, critical to what you're saying as well is that recognising that what we see as familiar is very unfamiliar to others, and particularly meeting procedure. You know, back to that point that maybe we're all the odd bod sitting here on the Tuesday night. That what we do isn't familiar to everybody and remembering that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jenny.
One last question in the chat function from Sally.
There's actually a couple of others as well about strategies for dealing with martyrs. Martyrs is certainly one that needs a conversation, and sometimes you actually have to be quite firm with them and say, we need you to be thinking about the organisational memory that you have and starting to develop ways to make sure other people can do the roles that you do so well. Can you mentor somebody and so on, trying to put the ball in their court for passing on some of the things that they know and know how to do. That's the only strategy I've seen work really well. And even then it takes a bit of convincing. You have to start with something small. We've also, trying to break the culture of things that I'm against and voted yes. You really have to just talk to people about the dangers of voting yes if they don't agree. And talk to people about the fact that robust debate is actually the basis of good decisions. So let's create time and space to actually disagree and have a good debate before we reach a decision. Now, finding volunteers is hard. People are time poor and don't need the three things as why people join groups. Those three things are not why they join, they're why they stay. So you actually need ways to get people in, to find out what it is that might get them in the door in the first place. And a lot of the time it's going to be creating opportunities that are small opportunities. Instead of getting them to join the committee straight away, get them to recruit working groups to work on whatever the new project is, get them to do things that require, we only need an hour a week for 6 weeks and that's all we'll ask of you this time. That sort of thing can be quite an important part of the whole process. Motivation to volunteer is something that is probably one of the most researched topics in the volunteering literature, and let me tell you, they keep coming up with different answers every single time. And those answers come from everything to, I think people do it because that's what you do. It's a normative thing, right the way through to I'm lonely, I need to make connections, and also I believe in what's happening. Now, there's a question here from Anita that says, is there a chain of command when it comes to PNCs, especially with other volunteers or parents who are causing issues and go around you to discuss with the principal if they're not happy? How can this be dealt with? That might be something that WACSSO has a policy on or an approach on, I don't know. But one of the things, there's two things about that. One of them is that the principal is in a difficult position in that they need to feel, they need parents to feel that they can approach them at any time. But the principal can also be a good conduit for encouraging robust debate or conversation. But people go around the committee to the principal, then the principal should be encouraging them to be involved in the meetings and in the discussions.
Yes.
If they're not happy, why are they not happy? What is it that's leading to that? Are they not getting a say, or are they feeling like they're not getting a say, or are they just being difficult? Because sometimes that's what people are doing. It is the case that you and the principal, the committee and the principal need to be trying to work out a way to be on the same page about how that's responded to. It's my understanding that the principal is an ex officio member of the executive and therefore should be part of the conversations about how to manage some of these situations. I know that it's not always the case that the principal and the PNC are really close, so sometimes that's also a difficult situation. It may be that there are others who have an observation in relation to that, Anita, before we draw this to a close. Anybody want to comment? Camilla. Our principal comes to most meetings and I think that helps. The school and the PNC are on the same page. In my time on PNC, most of the time that was the situation. There was only one situation where we had a principal who wasn't on the same page as the PNC. We just had to work with that and get it to, the uncomfortable relationship didn't last all that long because the person was only there for a year filling in for somebody else. But that might also have been why they felt that they couldn't side with the PNC. I don't know. I don't want to get into all of that, but it can be a difficult situation if you don't have that.